From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The United Auto Workers strikes labor deals with General Motors and Stellantis, ending a strike of more than 6 weeks. What are the terms and how will they affect the big three automakers in the years to come? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Kim Strassel. The UAW's walkout had more than 45,000 workers on the picket lines at 9 factories and dozens of parts centers. But after tentative deals with Ford last week, Stellantis over the weekend, and General Motors on Monday, those auto workers are now going back on the job. Here's a piece of a video posted to YouTube Tuesday by UAW President Shawn Fain taking a victory lap on his negotiations.
For the past several weeks, analysts and pundits were crying that our union was going too far, that we were demanding too much. We didn't listen to them, and we never let up. The result is one of the most stunning contract victories since the sit-down strikes in the 1930s. We were relentless in our fight to win a record contract, and that is exactly what we accomplished. If ratified, GM salaried workers will be provided general wage increases for the first time in our history.
Monet, what did these auto workers get? We talked a little bit on the show about the Ford deal last week. How does that compare to the deals struck with Stellantis and GM?
Well, the deals that the UAW has reached tentatively with Stellantis and GM are definitely patterned very closely on the terms that Ford agreed to. That tends to be the case among the automakers, that they try to stay very close together in terms of what they're willing to offer the union so that they can approach these negotiations from a united front. But what they got was a 25% raise over the 4-year lifespan of the contract. So that will bring the average production worker at these companies from about $32 per hour today to about $40 per hour. They also have a much shorter track for new hires to reach top pay. That will take only about 3 years from when you get in the door to when you are granted essentially senior status. And they also got cost of living adjustments in their pay. So that means that in a time like now, when the inflation rate is elevated, that's going to be an additional bonus on top of the built-in pay raises over the 4-year lifespan of the contract. And there are a few other details, too, that are very important that I think have gotten a little bit less coverage in the headlines that have come out about the deal. And one of those is the right to strike over plant closures. So right now, the contract only requires union workers to be able to go on strike at the end of a particular contract or for a variety of other specific disputes that might arise. But it doesn't allow them to go on strike when one of the automakers threatens to close down or consolidate a plant. And having that ability to essentially veto plant closures is something that's going to force GM, Stellantis, and Ford to think very hard about trying to retool their plants or shift production to states where they can produce a little bit less expensively. And over the long run, that's going to really, really affect how profitably they're able to produce. And so this was not merely a big bump up in wages, as Shawn Fain was saying, but it's something that's going to alter the strategies and the potential profitability of these big three companies for the foreseeable future.
The automakers seem to have decided that that was the price they were willing to pay for labor peace and ending the strikes, getting back on the job, or at least preventing the strikes from spreading to others of their plants, their more profitable plants, including their truck plants. But Kim, I'm focused on the question that Monet raised here, which is how does this affect the competitiveness of the big three automakers? Because in the clip that we played, Shawn Fain said that these were the biggest victories for workers since the 1930s. But we live in an environment that is nothing like the 1930s. And I'm leaning on a CNN article for a few of these details. But now we have a very competitive auto sector. Nissan came to Tennessee in 1983. BMW has a big presence in Spartanburg, South Carolina. That began in 1994. Mercedes-Benz is in Alabama starting in 1997. Honda in Alabama starting in 2001. There are also Volkswagen, Toyota, Hyundai, Kia factories in the South. And overall, according to CNN, the Midwest used to have about 60% of auto jobs. That was a figure from 1990, and now it's 45%. And the South has risen from 15% to 30%. And so this is not a 1930s environment. Another quote from Shawn Fain that struck me, this is in the Journal's article. He said, "We wholeheartedly believe that our strike squeezed every last dime out of General Motors." And Kim, in the coming years, I guess that will be the question.
Yeah, that's right. Look, one of the numbers that was really striking in a Wall Street Journal story about this is that right now the estimate is that United Auto Workers at these different outfits currently are paid somewhere in the mid $60 per hour for wages and benefits. Analysts are now expecting that after this deal, and pay attention to this number, it's quite striking, that average number is going to go up to $87 to $90 an hour in wages and benefits for many of these workers. So a rough calculation of about 30% more. And that has to be measured, as you say, against the competitive field of all of those automakers who are now in right-to-work states, most of them foreign-owned. Also, certain American companies like Tesla, which are not unionized and are increasingly grabbing a share of the EV market. Put this, too, in the context of the fact that most of these big automakers, Stellantis and Ford and GM, are absolutely heaving under the weight of these EV mandates that are coming out of Washington, D.C. They are struggling. Their losses are already mounting. Recently, Ford came out that its EV losses for Q3 were $1.3 billion. It is now estimated that it's losing about $33,000 to $36,000 on every EV it makes. And now you're going to add in these extraordinary new labor costs to that formulation. And it is no surprise that even before this strike was settled, that you had many of the CEOs of these groups coming out to say the current status quo is not sustainable. That's before you add in the deal and what it's going to mean for their bottom line and their costs. And this is the big picture that nobody's talking about. The minutia, as Monet said, has been on the ins and outs of these deal that was struck by the UAW. But the overall broad picture of certain American automakers, especially those under the thumb of UAW, is very, very bleak. And it's a combination not just of these labor demands, but of Washington mandate demands that are going to make a profitable future all but impossible for many of these car makers.
That is another big part of this story. And Monet, according to the Journal's report, GM has agreed to put battery plant workers making its cells under the master UAW agreement. So also a clear move by the UAW to get some of those EV workers also under its wing here. Though one question also remains whether this EV push will ultimately peter out. Some interesting news in the past week. The chairman of Toyota casting doubt on that, saying people are finally seeing reality. There are many ways to climb the mountain that is achieving carbon neutrality. And so maybe there will be a turn back toward hybrids. GM and Honda recently said they were ditching a partnership. This is, again, a Journal story, ditching a partnership forged a year and a half ago aimed at developing a line of lower-priced EVs. GM abandoning a self-imposed target to build 400,000 EVs by mid-2024. And so, Monet, it is an open question, it seems to me. I do think that these automakers are in a pinch between these higher labor costs that they are being hit with, and then also these requirements that they build these unprofitable electric vehicles, though one of those things could give, which is that the market could take a turn toward hybrids or away from EVs if consumers prove that they are unwilling to buy those off the lots.
Well, I think you outlined the problem for the automakers exactly right, in that we are in a moment where they're essentially reckoning with the fact that EVs are not going to play the role in their immediate future that they hoped that they would 5 to 10 years ago. Of course, they understand that these vehicles are very expensive to produce, but hoped that they would essentially be loss leaders, that even selling them at a loss, you're going to have a rapidly growing market. You're going to have subsidies from Washington in the form of electric vehicle credits that make it less expensive for consumers to buy them, and that the market would expand fast enough and that the technology would become efficient fast enough that very quickly you'd get into a place where they're able to invest in those profitably. But that progress just has not come nearly as quickly as they hoped in terms of the reduction of the price of producing the EVs or in terms of the actual demand for buying them. And so you do have a lot of these companies revising their investments into EVs, curtailing them a little bit. But at the same time, you now have the UAW insisting that it have control over the terms on which these cars are being built. That's going to raise the labor cost involved in producing all of these electric vehicles, which is a huge problem for the automakers because the labor costs are the one area of EV production where they're actually able to save. The component costs for cars are much higher than a traditional gas-powered vehicle, but they require a significant amount of less labor than traditional gas-powered vehicles. I believe about 30% fewer man-hours go into producing EVs because they don't have nearly as many moving parts as a gas engine would. So now, if these companies are going to have inflated labor costs in addition to the inflated production costs, that means that the investment that they've already committed to EVs is going to be an even bigger loser for them, and they're going to lose a ton of ground to the more nimble, non-unionized companies that are able to change their plans quickly. And so that's something that we're going to see playing out very painfully for the big three over the next few years.
And the other part of this conversation is attrition and automation. The Journal's editorial on the tentative Ford deal last week suggested that that might be one way the automaker ends up dealing with these costs is building more cars with more robots, the way that some of its competitors like Tesla do. And so it could be, Kim, that you end up with a UAW deal that is great in the short term for the current workers, but that makes these automakers uncompetitive in a way that threatens the long-term prospects for those companies, for those profits, and then ultimately for the jobs of the peoples in those plants.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really important point is that, again, as all of these automakers have said, status quo cannot remain. And while the UAW tried to get provisions in this contract that would give it more tools going forward against certain changes that might be obvious, there are going to be others that were left open to automakers to pursue that could hurt future UAW members. I would also note that just talking about those future UAW members, one thing that was really remarkable about this deal too was the amount of money that the union leaders were able to demand that the automakers put into the accounts of retirees, quite significant dollars. And so there's going to be a lot of money that's being directed to people that aren't even in the UAW even anymore, that they're out of the business. That is going to potentially make things harder for current UAW members, future UAW members. This overall seemed to be very much a deal that was very short-sighted, very near term. It certainly allows Shawn Fain to brag that they got what they hoped for, but it seems to be a deal in which there was not a lot of future planning.